Okay, in this lecture we're going to turn to another set of mental states you could call feelings, and for the sake of this lecture I'll divide feelings up into attitudes and emotions, which will define the two halves of the lecture. So attitude, first of all, well, attitude means different things depending on the group of people you're talking to. For different academics it has different definitions. For a social psychologist, an attitude is a positive and negative evaluation. It's essentially some feeling that you hold towards an object or state of affairs. So liking would be an attitude, and we have in the unconscious memory lecture considered unconscious determinants of liking in the form of the mere exposure effect. So you can subliminally show people unusual shapes, polygons that have just been constructed, and thereby increase people's liking of those shapes later on. So there what you had was subliminal perception of the shape, later leading to a conscious liking of the shape, because the person rates that shape as something they like more later, so it's a conscious liking. So one question about attitude is, can there be unconscious determinants of it? But what I want to consider this lecture is a different question, namely, can the attitude itself be unconscious? And that hasn't been shown by any of the material that we've considered previously in the module. So here's an experiment that maybe goes just a little bit beyond the demonstrations of mere exposure with subliminal stimuli. In this experiment, cocaine addicts were subliminally exposed to either sexual stimuli, cocaine drug-related stimuli, or aversive stimuli. These were shown for 33 milliseconds and masked, these images, while people were in the scanner. Then later on, the degree to which people had a positive or negative attitude towards these stimuli was assessed, and also with a separate group of subjects, still cocaine addicts. They looked at whether people could, when these images were flashed, whether people could classify them as being drug-related, sexual-related, aversive, or neutral. So this separate group was at chance, was at least non-significantly different from chance in classifying the items. So on the face of it, an objective threshold was reached, as shown by a separate group of participants classifying the items. So at least on the face of it, these images were presented subliminally. Nonetheless, when you looked at the contrast between sexual images and neutral images on the fMRI, you got reward circuitry lighting up for the sexual images and the cocaine-related images. So it seems there were subliminal stimuli, so that's the same as the mere exposure effect. You have subliminal stimuli. What they provided some evidence for is that the perception of the stimuli was unconscious. But in addition, what we see is at that very moment that the subliminal stimuli were presented, reward areas of the brain are lighting up. So does this show some sort of unconscious liking or positive effect? Do you think there's any evidence here that the attitude or the liking or the sense of being rewarded was unconscious?
It seems that way.
So why is the liking itself unconscious, or the positive feeling?
Well, because they're never aware of having consciously seen any of the stimuli. So if it's having an effect without the awareness of it, it has to be unconscious.
Yes, they're not conscious of seeing these stimuli.
Yeah, exactly.
They might be conscious of having certain feelings.
Okay.
So they're not asked anything in the scanner.
So maybe it's an unconscious determinant of attitudes rather than the actual attitude itself is maybe conscious.
Yes, exactly. So the question is, does this go beyond the mere exposure type demonstrations? So accepting for now that the objective threshold was reached, and we'll come back to that question actually at the end of the lecture, the perception was subliminal. But can we be sure that the feelings generated by that perception were subliminal? Well, I won't ask anything during the scanner. One reason for thinking that maybe it was is in terms of the behaviour of the separate group of subjects asked to classify these briefly flashed and backmasked images as being sex-related, cocaine-related, neutral or aversive. Given there are a chance at that, maybe they didn't have... Yes?
Yeah, would you think that they'd not be able to spot, but they'd react slightly different to something aversive to, say, something sexual or drug-related? So
Consciously, right?
Unconsciously,
Unconsciously.
but then be able to say, maybe give it a guess of how to categorise them?
Yes, I mean, if you're having conscious feelings, so I think we can say, but based on the brain data here, there were probably some reward-related feelings. The question is, were they conscious or unconscious? Right? Now, if you had conscious feelings, you'd think you could use them to classify the images, right? So if you're feeling a bit like good about drugs at the moment, you might guess that was a drug-related stimulus that had just been shown. But people don't always go with their feelings when asked to classify material on objective measures of perception. Maybe if you ask subjects to go with their feelings in classifying the images, you'd find they're above the objective threshold. So it's slightly an open question. I think this takes us beyond the mere exposure effect, but probably hasn't definitively nailed yet evidence for there being unconscious feelings. Any more comments on that?
Do you get this effect in non-addicts?
I don't know. You would imagine if you repeated the experiment with the sexual, aversive, neutral stimuli, that should work with anybody. So it'd be a good experiment to do. And to follow up in the sort of way I've suggested in asking people to explicitly talk about the feelings they have or to use them to classify what the pictures might have been on the objective threshold test. So here's another experiment that seems to indicate in the direction of unconscious feelings, but we'll talk about whether it really does. So these were men, you might have heard about this because this hit the news when it came out and has been around public media ever since. You take men who on a Kinsey scale score as exclusively heterosexual. They're also given a measure of homophobia. And then you divide men into homophobes and non-homophobes. You strap on something called a plethysmograph, which is, well, in this case, a penile plethysmograph is a sort of rubber band which has mercury in it, and then as it stretches, it changes its electrical conductivity. So it gives you a measure of penile circumference. In this graph here, they're watching a heterosexual video, and you look at the change in the circumference, and you see a good 20 millimetre increase in circumference for both groups. So nothing surprising there. The interesting thing is when you show them a homoerotic video, The non-homophobic men get some small reaction, but the homophobic men get a reaction that's pretty much half what they got to the heterosexual video. So the homophobes get aroused by man-on-man action in a way that non-homophobes don't. So the question is how to interpret that. I mean, one interpretation is that homophobes have unconscious desires or arousal. And if you want to be fully Freudian about this, you say it's being repressed and then expressed as hostility and aggression. Well, that's possible that we have here a case of unconscious desire or attitude. But there's other interpretations. It could be that they're quite aware of that they're quite conscious of their arousal, but they have negative attitudes about it. We needn't think our minds are all self-consistent. We can have impulses and urges that we don't like and think are wrong, a point that I'll be returning to later. Yes?
A question. Could it be that since your action is technically biologically autonomous, could it be that the stress of watching the homophobic men watching a homoerotic video is triggering some sort of stress that might have something to do with the circumference, the reaction, but that's just how it's being processed?
Yes. In fact, I think that there could be a lot in that suggestion. That the anxiety or negative emotion that goes along with being a homophobe creates generic arousal that then can become sexual arousal, if you like. In fact, there was a very interesting study by Barlow a few decades ago now, where again they used a penile plethysmograph. They put electrodes on the men's penises and said, well, one group were told, unless you get hard quick, we're going to shock you. Another group were not told anything like that. So there was performance-dependent stress produced, which, after experiment, the subjects reported created anxiety. But that was the group that got the greatest increase in penile circumference, the one with anxiety. So despite the fact that clinical practice often focuses on reducing anxiety to enhance sexual performance, the complete absence of anxiety isn't necessarily the ideal state of affairs. And indeed, a theory of why do some people find some things arousing could be based on the conversion of anxiety into sexual arousal. So the suggestion you made, I would see as a mechanism by which homophobia could be related to becoming turned on by homoerotic material. So the causal direction in that case goes from the homophobia to the sexual arousal, which isn't the opposite theory to what I suggested, the Freudian theory, where you go from the sexual arousal to the homophobia. But either theory would leave open the possibility that the sexual desire arousal was unconscious or conscious. The things we don't know. So I don't think this settles the question. And indeed, they could have quite conscious sexual desires and arousal, but they just don't want to admit it. They're just essentially lying when they said they're exclusively heterosexual. Especially on an issue like that, I think that's a hypothesis we have to take seriously. So, like the last case, I think this opens up some interesting conjectures, but doesn't quite yet nail with some firm evidence the existence of unconscious attitude. So now I want to move on to different sort of test, the implicit attitude test. That was first designed around about 10-15 years ago, and then there was just an explosion in use of these sorts of tests in order to measure what was called implicit attitudes. Probably a lot of you have come across this test, but anyway, let's do a classroom example of it, just so you get a feel for how it works. So what I want you to do on a sheet of paper is to have two columns like this. For the first test, we'll do on this side, I want you to put a tick if the word there is either a pleasant word, like, I don't know, baby or flower or something like that, or a dog. So if it's some dog name or some word indicating a dog, put it on that side. And on this side, if it's an unpleasant word or a cat, put a tick on this side. Okay? Is everyone ready? So really what I want you to do is just introspect about the difficulty you find in doing this compared to when we switch it round the other way. Okay? So the outcome here, because I'm not measuring anything, will just be your introspection about how difficult you felt this way of classifying things as opposed to, we'll see next time, another way of classifying things. All right, so I'll now present 8 words, and you just classify them in the way described. And we'll see if you're a dog person or a cat person. So try and work as quickly as you can while being accurate. All right. Has everyone done that? Yes. Okay. So incidentally, if it doesn't translate to Chinese very well, Siamese is a type of cat. Siamese cat, and Border Collie is a type of dog. Tabby Tom is a type of cat. All right. So now we're going to do it the other way around. So I'm going to show you some more words. Pleasant or cat on the one side, and now unpleasant or dog on the other side. All right, I'll show you some words. And just get a sense for whether this task is easier or more difficult than the previous one. All right. Did anybody find one of them more easy or difficult than the other? Yes.
Yeah, I found the first one much easier.
First one much easier. And are you a dog person? You are.
Apparently.
Yeah. Any cat people here?
I found the cat one easier.
Yeah. And would you rather have a cat pet or a dog pet?
I'd rather have a cat, yeah.
You would rather have a cat. There you go. And you too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we would need to do some counterbalancing to make this sort of realistic. We'd want, generally when they do this, you have quite a few blocks. We'd need to counterbalance the words, so sometimes Alsatian would have to be in the dog unpleasant condition, sometimes in the dog pleasant condition, right? So you don't get confounds with how quickly people process different words. And also they tend to swap round as well, have blocks with pleasance on one side and on the other side. But anyway, you get the idea, as long as you do the right sorts of counterbalancing. The idea of the implicit attitude test is that if you have an implicit attitude, even if you don't know it, even if you don't want to admit it, you'll be slower to categorize one way than the other way. And in particular, you'll find it easier to put together in the same category things that go together in your mind, for example, good things and whatever the category is. Of course, when people do it really, they're measuring reaction times, so we have a exact measure of actual performance. So Greenwald et al. Developed this in 1998. If you wanted to try some actual tests to looking at your racial prejudice, maybe your youth versus elderly prejudice and so on, there's a site in the handbook you can go to and you can run yourself online. Now, in terms of a racial implicit attitude test, 75% of Americans show prejudice against blacks. In other words, they're faster with the black unpleasant combination than the black pleasant. So that's how it is right now, contemporary data. If you look at asking people how racially prejudiced they are, asking them, for example, would you be happy for your white daughter to marry a black man? Questions like this. In terms of such explicit ratings, there was massive prejudice 100 years ago, but it's almost completely disappeared now. There's some debate about whether it actually, to the extent to which it has disappeared, but at least it's been, on average, massively reduced, maybe disappeared in some areas of America. Although that, as I say, is a matter of debate. But let's just take at face value a very small explicit measures of prejudice, but large degree of prejudice as shown on these and similar implicit attitude tests. So the question I want to ask is that a case of unconscious attitudes? To what extent can we regard your performance on measures like this as indicating, when it contradicts what you say explicitly on explicit ratings of how prejudiced you are, as indicating an unconscious attitude, an unconscious feeling? Well, just as in the last case, we might wonder the extent to which on explicit measures people are simply not being entirely honest in reporting how they feel about something when they know it would be socially unacceptable to say certain things. And also, another point that's been brought up, you might wonder, maybe you're just looking at semantic associations that come about because people are aware of cultural stereotypes. It's nothing to do with their actual attitudes towards black people. It's to do with your knowledge that there is racism in society. And that knowledge is what underlies the reaction time differences. So let's go through some evidence that will address some of these questions. By the way, I rearranged some things in the handout, on the slides this morning, maybe a little bit late this morning. So depending on when you downloaded slides, if you've got the slides in front of you, experiments might be a little bit shuffled. So the question is, that I want to address first of all, is does the implicit attitude test predict behaviour? Because if it predicted how people behaved, if it predicted that people behaved in a prejudiced way, then it's doing more than simply indicating semantic knowledge of cultural stereotypes, right? It's indicating something about your own behaviour. And then we'll be a little bit closer to establishing whether or not it could be measuring in an unconscious attitude. So in this study by Lynch, he looked at the extent to which people laughed at different sorts of jokes. And laughter is an interesting one. I mean, we don't really know what the evolutionary function of laughter is. But one theory that's quite interesting is that it's an honesty signal about the group to which you belong. And that's why when people like to tell jokes, they often like the jokes to be a little bit obscure, so it's only the in-group that has the right knowledge will be able to put two and two together and go, ah, yeah, that's what you're talking about. And the extent to which the joke would then discriminate you from an out-group which will be ignorant of these things, to that extent the joke will be funny. You as a member of the in-group have the key that can unlock the secret of the joke, understand it, express it by your laughter, then you're recognised as one of the in-group. So as an honesty signal, if that theory is right, it will be quite a good measure because it would be an indication of something you actually believe. So it's funny because it's true, sometimes people say. So that was essentially the title of this paper. So subjects in this experiment were given a video clip of a stand-up comedian. In a what you call a neutral condition, he made jokes about divorce, skydiving, some other things, but not specifically about sex roles or race. In another little clip, I think about 2 minutes, the jokes were about why men do and should get paid more than women for the same work. So they were sexist jokes. And in another little few-minute clip, the jokes were racist jokes about how scary it is being a white person walking in a black neighbourhood. People were videoed, and they weren't told why they were watching these clips. They were just sat down, told to have a look at these videos. And while they're looking at the videos of the stand-up comedian, they themselves are being videoed, so that people can later score the face and score the extent to which certain muscles involved in laughter are being used. And what we have here is the extent to which people laughed more, say, on this side, to the racist jokes versus the neutral jokes. Okay, so you control just for baseline levels of laughter with the neutral case. And along here is the degree of racial bias as shown by an IAT. So the more you go in this direction, that's the more white good, black bad direction as shown on the implicit attitude test. And here is laughter at race jokes versus the neutral jokes. And here, this is belief in, as shown by an IAT task, implicit attitude task, in traditional gender roles. But the more easily you could associate male names with male professions, male-related professions, and the same for female names and female professions, or stereotypically female-male professions, and the extent to which people laughed at the sexist jokes. And you see he got a correlation, R was 0.35 between those measures. So the performance on the IAT task seemed to go beyond just cultural knowledge, as it were. It predicted the extent to which you found jokes funny that matched the prejudice as shown by the implicit attitude test. Now, in this study, they attempted to create attitudes towards objects from scratch, and then see if those created attitudes would show on implicit attitude test and show on actual choice behaviour of people. So the way it worked is for some minutes people were shown hundreds of pictures, just a stream of pictures would come on pictures and words would come on the computer screen. But unbeknownst, well, these subjects weren't told about it, there were pairings of two brand names made up, a Tarion pen or a 4-ball pen, pairings of one of those brands with a aversive image and the other brand with a pleasant image, or vice versa. So this was meant to be a form of evaluative conditioning, where you just constantly see in conjunction a certain novel brand and type of pen, which is essentially neutral in itself, with either negative things or positive things, and just get repeated exposure to that pairing. Now they claim, but they didn't give data in the paper that on awareness measure afterwards, that people were not aware of the contingencies involved. It's a bit hard to evaluate that claim because there wasn't precise data presented in the paper. But anyway, there was some evidence for that claim. Then they were given two types of tests for implicit attitudes. One is the standard IAT test, where you have one sort of pen has to be classified on one side with good things, and the other pen on the other side bad things, or vice versa, just as we did before with cats and dogs. Fazio devised another sort of way of getting at one's implicit attitudes, namely, in this case, you show the pen, but you don't respond to it, and then you classify an adjective as being good or bad. So this pen might be flashed, and then you get an adjective like fragrant, and you've got to say, is that good or bad? That's good. And the idea is that the image you see just beforehand might make the classification easier or more difficult based on a priming effect. That's another way of getting at implicit attitudes that's around. Then in the next stage, people were showing some adverts to do with the pens, and there was a list of characteristics of each pen. Now, actually what happened was the pen that had been paired with positive stimuli over here in the evaluative conditioning was given less favourable descriptions in the advert than the other pen. So the explicit information here went in the opposite direction to the evaluative conditioning that they first had. Subjects were either asked to focus on the explicit information, they were asked to evaluate each pen based on the advert, or they're just asked to evaluate how easy the advert was to read, so they're not taking in the advert very carefully about its evaluative statements. Then finally, they're given a list of things to choose about what they would like, including the pens, and you see which pen they choose. So this is the choice behaviour we're interested in. So the idea is, by repeated pairings here, can you change or influence what people actually choose in terms of what pen they want later on? Okay. And how is that related to implicit attitudes here and to explicit attitudes that might have been induced by these adverts? So it's a slightly complicated experiment. Are there any questions on the procedure there? All right, so the first thing to say is the implicit attitude test and the effective priming test both got significant results in the direction that you expect. So extended pairings of what start off as neutral stimuli with positive and negative stimuli lead to change on the implicit attitude test. Furthermore, when people didn't focus on the advert too strongly, they chose the pen that they had been conditioned to like, hopefully, a majority of the time. So it affected their choice behaviour. Indeed, in this condition, the extent to which they chose the pen could be predicted by the implicit attitude test. So implicit attitudes can control choice behaviour. Now, in this case, the causes may be unknown if we accept their claims that people were unaware of the contingencies in the initial evaluative contingency phase. And maybe the implicit attitude test is measuring attitudes that have been built up by habit. So implicit attitude test predicts behaviour. I'm just giving you a sample of the data that's out there. But we still might wonder, does it predict behaviour any better than conscious reports? It might indeed be a reflection of the attitude, but might just be another way of measuring conscious attitudes. So let's have a look at a couple of other studies. So in this study, physicians were given a little vignette or scenario where they're giving a picture of a black or white person and symptoms of a heart problem, and we're told that the optimal treatment for the symptoms that are being presented is thrombolysis or clot busting, blood thinning. And one thing you can look at is the extent to which this optimal treatment was recommended for black or white people. Later on, the physicians were tested on their implicit attitude with an IAT racial prejudice test, and they were asked to give their explicit racial attitude in terms of their ratings about their attitude towards black and white patients. Now, the implicit and explicit prejudices did correlate, 0.3. But there was no significant correlation between recommending the ideal treatment and explicit racial preference. But it's a non-significant result, so it's very hard, and the means weren't given, so it's very hard to evaluate the sensitivity of that measure. But in any case, what they claimed is no correlation with the explicit measure. But if you look here with the implicit measure, this one is low prejudice shown on the implicit attitude test, and that's high prejudice. This is the extent to which good treatment is recommended to the black patient and the white patient. And you see as implicit attitude, implicit prejudice increases, physicians are less and less likely to recommend the best treatment to black patients, and conversely for white patients. So racial implicit attitude predicts differential degree to which best treatment is given. Yes.
Is there an explanation as to why they would offer the best treatment to black people in the low implicit score?
Yes, it's a curious aspect of the data. It seems that although the authors are right that as implicit prejudice increases, best treatment goes down for black people, but nonetheless, we start off with what looks like preferential treatment for black people when you have negative implicit attitudes, and that's slightly strange. If this was really preferential when you have low black prejudice, you have preferential treatment for. So that doesn't mean you're prejudiced for white people. You just have low prejudice against black people. Yes.
If it was simply low prejudice, it would be identical. Like the treatment suggested would be identical for black and white patients.
Yes, it should. Yeah, that's right.
But it's not.
But it's not. So there is an odd aspect of the data. That's right.
Could that then suggest that they are overcompensating for kind of like perceived social attitudes in general? And in that
Yes.
case, that also suggests that the IAT is not a completely unconscious kind of measure because, as you can see, they're kind of compensating for social.
Yes. It could be this. See, this wasn't a real patient, as it were. They knew this was just a vignette, just a study. And well, each physician only got one case to judge. They happened to be black, they happened to be white. So they wouldn't necessarily know that this was about race. But if they did know it was about race, they might be overcompensating. Or maybe they overcompensate anyway, even though they didn't know that that was the point of this study. Yes, that would be true. But what would be nicer is to put this in a context where it's not seen as a study, but as a genuine part of your professional practice. And that's what the next study did, not with physicians, but with hiring managers who were sent job applications. So these are real hiring managers, actually interested in getting people for jobs. And they were sent applications where, as shown by the photograph on the application, some people were more overweight than others. So we can look at the extent to which obesity is influencing the manager's decisions. So is there prejudice against obese people? Later on, the managers took an obesity IAT and a couple of explicit questions, like, when hiring staff, I strongly, one end of the scale slightly, the other end of the scale, prefer normal weight individuals to obese individuals. Now, there was a pretty big effect, actually, and this, as I said, this is, in a real context, these are hiring managers who think they're getting real applications, and you look at the extent to which they'll pursue that application further. So one standard deviation increase in implicit obesity prejudice lowered the callback rate for an obese job applicant by 8 percentage points. That's pretty huge. Whereas the explicit attitude did not significantly predict prejudiced behaviour. So we have here the IAT predicting actual on-the-job prejudice. Yes?
It doesn't, like, when you're hiring people, I don't know what jobs they were hiring them for, but surely you kind of want to avoid obese people a little bit anyway because of, like, the medical problems, so the higher risk of medical problems, and a lot of jobs involve some kind of, physical performance, at least, in part maybe, and it kind of seems that maybe they're just hiring. Maybe it's just better to hire.
Right, it depends on the job, and I can't remember now what, or if they specify what the job was. I mean, if it's to be, if it's a physically demanding job, it might be part of the job specification that you should be fit. The question is, if it's not part of the job specification, should it be part of the basis on which you employ people? Let's say it was to be a shop assistant. Is it acceptable that obesity is part of, or being overweight or not is part of, how you select people? In any case, that's a slightly separate moral issue. What is interesting is they were asked explicitly their attitudes on precisely this. And we had the IAT measure. The IAT did a better job of predicting whether they're right or wrong to have their prejudice, which is, as I say, a slightly separate question.
They're not allowed to show the prejudice anyway. If they're hiring for, like, a real job, you're not allowed to hire based on obesity, but surely it's there.
Right. So again, you could raise the same question we raised before. Is the IAT just a more honest measure of attitudes, not more unconscious attitudes? But if you ask people explicitly to give their ratings on socially sensitive topics, there's a bigger tendency for people to give you what they think is socially acceptable in the explicit ratings. So the fact that the IAT did a better job than the explicit attitude doesn't mean that these attitudes are unconscious. It might just mean it's a better measure of people's attitudes in situations where people are going to self-consciously monitor what they're saying to make sure it fits in with society's expectations of what's acceptable. Yes?
Is it possible that the reason behind this kind of prejudice is because people want to either hire or trade or anything, people that look like them? Like, if the hiring managers were thin, they were more likely to hire someone that looked like them.
It could well be.
So that could be simply not biological, but natural.
Yeah, so the bias might not be about weight or overweight per se. The bias might be a bias towards people who are like me. So if that person put on weight over Christmas, became a bit obese, they'll start hiring obese people. If they did an exercise program and lost it all, they'd start hiring more slim people. But nonetheless, at that point in time, whatever the reasons for the prejudice, one could say, to the extent that you did have an obesity prejudice as shown on the IAT, that does predict your hiring behaviour. mean, if nothing else, it shows that the IAT does predict behaviour, it's not just knowledge of cultural stereotypes. But, as we've been talking about, maybe the IAT is just less subject to dishonesty. And there are a couple of studies out there you could chase up looking at whether people can fake the IAT. You say to people, I want you to fake a prejudice this way or that way. And it turns out to be very difficult. You can do it. There is a method for doing it. It turns out that not many subjects spontaneously think of it, and they find it very hard to overcome the prejudice, their pre-existing prejudice as revealed by the IAT. It could be that the IAT reflects unconscious attitudes, but there's a third possibility. The IAT might measure automatic tendencies that you are aware of. Remember, we talked about in a previous lecture how automaticity and conscious-unconscious, they're really different dimensions. So you can do something automatically, even though it involves quite conscious knowledge. So maybe the IAT, the attitudes as reflected in the IAT, reflect your spontaneous gut reactions, your first reactions, whether or not you think they're valid or invalid. But your self-reported attitudes are the ones that, on reflection and considering all the beliefs you hold, on balance, you think things should be this way or that way. So you could be aware of your initial reaction. You might, for example, feel uneasy when you see someone dressed up in Muslim-related attire with a backpack on, sits next to you on the train. Your first reaction might be tension. Then you might reflect on that and think, no, that's unacceptable. That's not a reaction that I'd want to pursue, or I think is a good reaction. So you can have automatic reactions in a situation that you judge to be bad. Just as I was talking about one of the very first experiments, our minds aren't necessarily all self-consistent. We can have feelings and attitudes that we don't agree with, that contradict our reflective, clear judgments. So I finally came across a study that I felt really addressed the issue that I was interested in, and that is, are the attitudes in the IAT conscious or unconscious? And I actually found it very difficult to find studies that were relevant to this, because the literature seemed to just have the presumption that it was unconscious, but without really good evidence to establish it. And then I found this study that raised the very question I was interested in and addressed it in a useful way. The way they did it was to have each subject perform 5 IATs to do with prejudice towards different types of groups. Asian versus white, youth versus being older. Most people have a prejudice towards youth, for example, even elderly people. The crucial thing they did was to say to people to describe the IAT task and to say, how difficult do you think you'll find this sorting task? Do you think for this group of people, and they're showing pictures, they're showing, if you had these photos of, say, celebrities versus Joe Blow, regular guy, and you had to sort them into good and bad, sometimes one way, sometimes the other way, which way do you think you'll go on this task? So you're asking people to predict their IAT performance. They also asked to give their explicit attitudes, what they actually felt about these different groups, black, Latino, Asian, celebrity, child, adult, and so on. So we get their explicit prejudice as given by their ratings. Now, the important thing is the correlation between the attitude as shown on the IAT and the person's own prediction about how they'll do on the IAT task was 0.6, which is high. I mean, people were good at predicting how they'll do on this task. So people seem quite aware of their automatic attitudes. Nonetheless, the correlation between the implicit and explicit attitudes was, though significant, quite low, which replicates previous results. So one's considered opinion need not be the same as an immediate reaction. So I think what this shows is the IAT makes a good sort of automatic reaction versus considered opinion distinction. But we don't have grounds to think it makes a conscious versus unconscious distinction. That doesn't mean that there is no such thing as unconscious attitudes, and that on top of everything I've said, there still might be unconscious attitudes that are picked up by the IAT. It's just that the matter, despite the thousands of articles produced in the area, the matter hasn't been properly investigated. And I don't rule out unconscious attitudes. No. As a higher order thought type person, of course attitudes can be unconscious. You just have to have the attitude but not the higher order thought about it. It's conceptually very possible and be nice to show it. It's just I don't think yet there's any evidence out there for unconscious attitudes. But if you in your reading find some evidence, I mean this is huge literature, I've tried to find what's relevant in there and give some example studies, please let me know so I can update this for next year. All right, let's stop and have a break, and then after the break we'll talk about emotion. All right, now we're going to talk about emotion and whether there could be unconscious emotions. So could we really be happy and not know it, contrary to the popular song about being happy? I found that this seems to give people conflicting intuitions. Some people say, well, how is it possible to have unconscious emotions? That's ridiculous. And other people say, yeah, why not? So just to get the ball rolling, perhaps you could say to the person next to you, what do you think about just the conceptual possibility of unconscious emotion? Does it make sense to be unconsciously happy or unconsciously sad and so on? What do you think? Tell the person next to you.
What's the point?
Like I smile and I don't think I don't smile.
It's just what are we saying? What are we saying? Happy is.
Sunny.
Well, I was suggesting that.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Is that you were looking for what happened when you like something?
For example, say, what if you don't like sugar? Sugar is just one time. And you're a reward center.
Would that count as being
No, I'm not saying it should be important. But then it can be easy to say something.
I've got butterflies, you know.
But liking, yeah, like the rewards and things don't light up. So liking,
as long as it your behaviour is following
In a sense, I've known you already. It's like,
It's like you might be rewarded exactly.
yeah. You realise you've gone
registered unconsciously, they're unconsciously registered, but that's not necessarily
Well, that's why that thing wasn't very
Yeah, we're just like, why?
All right. Any reactions? Anybody want to say what they think?
I would say is you can't be unconscious because an emotion is a thought of something, and you're
An emotion is a.
it's like a feeling of something. You
It's a
can't
feeling.
Be aware of that feeling without introspection, and introspection is not possible unconsciously.
Right. So yes. Okay.
I think you can be unconsciously feeling it and experiencing it, but not aware of it. So it's happening, and it like you had a really good point about you don't realise you're happy until you're well. You can have it where you don't realise you were happy until you become grumpy or something.
Right.
So to me, that feels like you weren't consciously aware of being happy in that moment until you're aware that you're not in this moment.
Yes. I think there's a passage or song about that, isn't there?
Maybe.
Yeah.
And what about repressed emotions?
Mm-hmm.
So after, say, something that it could be sad or tragic in your life, you don't, afterwards people go through a certain period where they're numb, and then emotions come out, but
Yes.
if you ask them what they're feeling at that moment, they don't really know. But then afterwards they can tell you that
Actually, they're in mourning or something like that. Yes.
I was upset, I was this one.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I kind of think you can't really have an unconscious emotion. I think if you are having something you would call an unconscious emotion, it's probably not an emotion. I mean, surely the function of an emotion is to change your conscious. It's like a decision-making process, isn't it? Evolutionarily. So if it is unconscious, then surely shouldn't be classified as an emotion.
Okay.
That's
But how about the different experience of emotions? Like in some Asian people, they have different terminologies for shame, for example,
Mm-hmm.
but not in the Western cultures. So don't we feel particular emotions, and other cultures feel the particular emotions? Or emotions is how we express them? And what is the possibility that somebody does not know how to express their emotions
Yes.
and cannot identify what it is?
Yes.
So it's kind of unconscious, but exists.
So some cultures make more distinctions amongst emotions than other cultures. And the question is, does everybody nonetheless feel those emotions, but they're just, because I don't have concepts for them, maybe they don't recognise they're in an emotion. That could be one point. So you're asking that as a question, or maybe they don't have the emotions without the concepts. So there's a sort of a split of opinion about it, and to a certain extent it depends, as was being discussed over here, on how you define an emotion. So if you break down an emotion, it involves what's often called an appraisal of a situation, which means a judgment about how the world is in relation to yourself, how important aspects of the world are that affect your ongoing projects. So, could you feel fear if it didn't involve expecting something bad to happen imminently? So in other words, we need the judgment, something bad is going to happen imminently for there to be fear there. So it involves an appraisal. Emotion involves cognitive changes, like your attention might be broader or more focused. Your attention might be biased towards certain sorts of information rather than others, depending on the emotional state. Physiological changes in heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, flushing, hormone levels, and so on. Behavioural changes. Anger involves the urge to acting out revenge. an injustice has been done to me or someone I care about, therefore I'm going to do something bad back again to set things right. Or changes in facial expressions. So emotion involves these things, but as you guys were saying, it also involves a feeling or phenomenology. Now, if you wanted that feeling to be necessarily conscious, then we'd rule out unconscious emotion as a matter of definition. But if we were to say that we don't require the feeling to be conscious, then it becomes an open empirical question as to whether every other aspect of emotion could be unconscious. And there is a question about what do these feelings consist of. I mean, they might simply consist of all these other things, or some subset of them, some combination of them, maybe the perception of these things. So that's not necessarily an additional characteristic. Another way of looking at this is in terms of theories of emotion and asking, according to the different theories of what emotion is, could that thing, whatever it is, be unconscious? Or is it necessarily conscious? Now, there is a particularly rich theory of emotion that goes back to the Stoics, about 250 BC, and developed especially by Chrysippus. And he actually had most of the components that now contribute to modern day theories of emotion. So according to Chrysippus, emotion is a judgment. For example, anger is the judgment that injustice against me has happened. And in modern day theories, say with Lazarus and others, that's become the appraisal theory of emotion. Emotion is an appraisal. According to Chrysippus, emotion isn't just an appraisal or judgment, it's a specific judgment linked to an action tendency. So anger is the appraisal, an injustice against me has happened, and therefore revenge must be taken. And you have the urge, the impulse to act out that particular sort of action, revenge. And that's led to theories of emotion, that emotion is essentially an action tendency. So now, if we accept these as theories of emotion here, well, we considered in previous lectures that judgments can be unconscious. At least we considered the case of judgment knowledge, and we argued there was evidence that that could be unconscious, right? We haven't considered intentions, whether that can be conscious or unconscious, but we will do so in a future lecture. We'll be looking at unconscious intentions. So, if emotion is either a judgment or a judgment linked to an action, as Chrysippus says it's the linking, or it's just the action, those components can be unconscious. In that case, emotion can be unconscious. Another sort of theory is emotion is a perception of an inner state. And again, we can take this theory back to Chrysippus. Chrysippus was a materialist. He thought emotional states were physical states. You have different sides. One side of a particular physical state, well, he located it in the heart, is something physical. The other side is something mental. But it's all essentially physical. And when you're in an emotional state, the physical stuff that constitutes the mind contracts, expands, and moves, and the awareness of these movements create the feelings that you have during emotions. I think independently, I'm not sure he was influenced by the Stoics, but anyway, William James came up with a theory of emotion, which was about the perception of inner states and behaviour. To him, that's what emotion was. And Anil Seth here at Sussex has developed such a theory of emotion as well. So now, if emotion is a perception of an inner state, we've argued in previous lectures that perceptions can be unconscious. So if perceptions of things in the world can be unconscious, why not perceptions, interoceptive perceptions? Yes.
Surely that is the definition of higher order thought. If it's perception of a process within yourself, isn't that the conscious mental state? Surely.
Yes, that's a very good point, and it will depend on whether the thing within yourself is a mental state or not.
Oh yeah.
So if it was things like high blood pressure, arousal, but you're right, we're on a grey area here. So it would depend then on what inner state was taken to be the state that's required for emotion. And if there's something mental about it, you would have a very good point there. Now there's another sort of theory that emotion is essentially a signal. I mean, why do we compulsively display our emotions in our face unless emotions had some social function, communicative function? So anger might really be a signal, you need to take my interests more seriously. I'm being slighted, take me more seriously. Well, there's no reason why a signal shouldn't be unconscious. We can think of creatures that signal in various ways without us having to attribute consciousness to that signaling process. So that's a very rough overview of theories of emotion, and you could argue that those theories leave open the possibility of unconscious emotion. Interesting, if we look back in the history of claims about conscious and unconscious, maybe the very first claim of mental processes being unconscious is the claim of emotion being unconscious, and that goes back to Lucretius, about 75 BC. He was a follower of Epicurus, and the Epicureans and the Stoics were arch enemies. So these are the people who are enemies of each other. They had fairly similar philosophies, actually not too dissimilar, although they saw themselves as polar opposites. We don't really know what Epicurus said. It was about 300 BC. We've lost almost everything that he wrote, and he wrote an awful lot. But one of the things he did talk about was the fear of death, and how the fear of death is pretty much universal and is responsible for many unpleasant ways people behave. And Lucretius brings it out and argues that fear of death can be postulated to explain why people have religious beliefs. Both Epicurus and Lucretius were materialists and against much of religion. Lust for power and fame, greedy accumulation of wealth, and frantic activity that never seems to console. Now what we find in Lucretius is the claim that the fear of death produces these behaviours and desires, but people are not aware of the fear of death. So we have the claim that the fear of death is unconscious, and that may go all the way back to Epicurus for all we know, but at least we have it in Lucretius. Incidentally, if you're interested in reading about his book, there's an interesting story about it on the nature of things. Greenblatt has a book that won the Pulitzer Prize for non-fiction and won another book award called Swerve, and he documents how this book here, there was a single copy left. It was almost lost to prosperity. It was then discovered in the 1400s, and he claims that it then had a huge influence on creating the Renaissance and modern life as we know it. So if you wanted to read a very popular book, look up Swerve on Amazon or somewhere else. So the whole point of the Epicurean philosophy was then to overcome your fear of death. First of all, to become aware of it, and then to overcome it. And one quote from Epicurus I like, which was, to help you overcome your fear of death, is where I am, death is not. Where death is, I am not. Meaning, as long as you're alive, there's no death, right? And when you're dead, you're not there anyway. So, enjoy life. Now, we see a modern echo of that in terror management theory. As far as I know, it wasn't influenced by the Epicureans, but some of the ideas are strikingly similar. So the idea of terror management theory is that being reminded of one's own mortality brings terror, hence the terror. Then you need to manage that terror. And how do you manage it? Well, one way of managing it is increasing your faith in your worldview. In other words, becoming part of something that's bigger than you and more eternal than you, that will outlive you. And if your cultural worldview involves some, as it will, some out-groups and some in-groups, you become more strongly identified with the in-group and hence more prejudiced towards people who are not in your in-group. So death anxiety is rarely experienced directly, though. So I didn't quite see the claim that death anxiety is unconscious, very explicitly stated, but I could in the writing see this claim that, unconscious death concerns, I put that in quotes to show there is the claim that these concerns can be unconscious, and that the death anxiety is rarely experienced directly, but is expressed by other means, namely often increases in prejudice towards out-group members. So let's look at some evidence. First of all, you prime mortality salience. So in terror management literature, this is a classical type of manipulation, by getting people to think about their own death. So write down the emotions you feel when you think about your own death. For control, you can say write down the emotions you feel about TV. And in this particular study, they had another situation that's anxiety-provoking because these are students. Write down the emotions you feel when you think about taking your next exam. Now, the idea is that the mortality salience condition is particularly fear of death that's going to increase prejudice. So if for these students a prostitute is not part of the in-group, then they should be more prejudiced against someone accused of prostitution. So what they had to do was they're given a little scenario and some description, and they had to say, well, they used the term bond in the paper. I take that to be the same as the English term bail, which is you say how much money must that person put down in order to be free and leave the court before they're either put in jail or set free completely, whatever the judge's verdict is. And then the subjects rated their emotion. In particular, they rated from 0 to 5 how strongly they had the following feelings of distress, upset, hostile, and so on. Now, by taking a sum of these 10 negative words here, we take an overall degree of negative valence. This is mortality salience, this is TV, and this is the exam group here. We see the exam group had overall more negative emotion than the other two groups, which didn't significantly differ. Which is perhaps a bit surprising. You ask someone to think about their own death, and they don't feel more negative after that on conscious ratings of mood. But when asked how much bond should this woman put down to give her temporary freedom before she comes back and is either locked up or set free, there's this enormous effect where the mortality salience group says something over $600, which is significantly different from the other two, either of the other two groups, which don't differ amongst themselves, which is something less than $200 or even $100. So a huge effect there on what looks like their prejudice against possible prostitutes. So my question is this: is this a case of unconscious death anxiety? Why unconscious? Well, because the mortality salience group is non-significantly different from the TV group on negative emotion when you get into actual rate emotion. But we've done something by thinking about their own death because of this massive effect here. So just say to the person next to you, how good do you think this evidence is for establishing unconscious death anxiety?
see why that would make. Even if you're
So I'd like to see it done with
But I just think
But I'd like to see it done with
I take it as a measure of self-respect and not anything really to do So it's not evidence for that.
Right, any reactions people want to say? Well, I think there were sceptical musings over here. Wasn't there?
I don't think it's evidence for there being like unconscious emotions like fear. I think it's more just demonstrating that if you make people think about their own death, they act more selfishly. Maybe. Very
So, how do we know that there is any fear going on here at all, consciously or unconsciously? That's your point.
Yeah, and even if terror management theory does suggest that this would happen because of unconscious fear, it doesn't actually support that there's unconscious fear. There's 1,000 reasons why you could get this effect without it being unconscious fear.
Yes. Yes, good point. Anybody want to? Yes.
I don't know if I just missed it, but I don't quite understand why being aware of your own mortality would make you judge a prostitute more harshly. I don't quite see the link.
Right, that's what makes it interesting, that the link is tenuous.
Yeah. Like, I'd rather
so-
see it with something that could be like life-affecting, like keeping a murderer in jail or something like that.
Yes.
I feel that that would have a stronger but more obvious link, maybe.
The way terror management theory argues that is it's the second step here. That so this is sort of the non-obvious claim made by the theory, but it matches the ones of the Epicureans. That fear of your own death increases faith in one's worldview. So remember this is America. So the American, I can't remember where this university was, but the American worldview might include the notion that prostitutes are evil. They'll be sent to hell. So let's say that is ideas floating around your community and you somehow feel part of that worldview. Then you're going to solidify your sense of being part of an in-group, and that you therefore going to judge more badly people who are part of the out-group. Yes.
Was this effect found? I mean, they obviously tried it on other sort of statements other than just prostitutes. And was it a similar thing each time? Or,
Well, again, I have to say, I'm not an expert in this literature, and it's huge. So if any of you find better evidence, then I would love to hear about it. But what I was looking for within this whole literature is measures of negative emotion coupled with some consequence that terror management theory should hold because of fear of death. And this was about the best study I found. Yes.
I was going to say, did they take sort of an attitude score on how they perceived prostitutes? Because surely, if they already all had negative views towards prostitutes, then it would reflect that yes, they are increasing their worldview. Whereas
Yes.
at the moment, you don't know what their original,
What the worldview is.
to know whether it's increasing.
You mean if prostitutes are held in negative esteem
Yeah.
by this group of people?
Yeah.
Maybe that was just taken as self-evident by the researchers in that cultural context. But yeah, it's a good point. So some questions to think about. Do we know what level the conscious fear of death was? I mean, what would have been nice is people rated how distressed, upset, and so on. These are pretty sort of blunderbuss. I mean, what would be really nice is an explicit statement about how afraid are you feeling right now about your own mortality. Otherwise that might get lost in all sorts of other things you could be distressed or not distressed about. A very explicit statement would have been nice. And do we know, as you were saying, was there any fear of death increased at all? I mean, one criticism of terror management theory is precisely the point that you raised, is maybe fear of death isn't the mediator of all this anyway. Maybe what happens is it's not that you've increased a fear of death, but when people think about danger, there's not via a fear of death, but just directly, as it were, maybe evolutionary inbuilt, a need to feel you're part of a group of people who will support you. So a need to validate and feel part of an in-group. And fear of death has got nothing special to do with that. It's not that you've increased fear of death consciously or unconsciously. Yes, did you have a point?
Surely, I mean, this is really dependent on the culture
Yeah.
and the religion, because if you kind of take Buddhist monks, for example, where death is not the end of life, then part of being afraid of death is because it's the end of it all for us as we see it.
Yes.
Then it's only applicable to kind of more our cultures.
Yes, good. Cross-cultural differences is a very good question. In fact, if you sort of Google terror management theory and Buddhism, you'll come up with a paper about Buddhist monks and terror management theory. In fact, but they make a point, well, it's really the same point as you're making in terms of cross-cultural differences, but slightly different. One of the claims of terror management theory, just like Epicurus said, is one way of dealing with your terror of death is by strengthening your religious beliefs. And conversely, having religious beliefs and thinking about them will reduce these effects that we see by priming mortality salience. This paper, I've forgotten the author now, argued that with Tibetan monks, the religion doesn't reduce the effects of mortality salience in the way it does for Christians, because Christians believe they're going to heaven, whereas Buddhists believe they're going to just carry on the cycle of suffering for many lifetimes to come. But that's right, what it illustrated was cross-cultural differences are there and do make a difference. So my personal reaction to this study was it's not yet convincing. I didn't think we had nailed it for an unconscious fear in this case. But if any of you looking into that literature find something better, then do let me know. I'd be very interested to see. Now, another line of research that's, and by the way, I should say, I don't think it was, in terror management theory, it wasn't their point to investigate unconscious emotions. That's just something I'm trying to extract from it to see what's there because it seems relevant. And that's why the issue hasn't been properly addressed, and that's why there isn't, well, as far as I can tell, there isn't good evidence within that literature. There's another literature that bears on the question about repressors. And they are people who actually have high anxiety, but claim not to have high anxiety. So the measure that's used to show this, that's around now, was introduced by Weinberger, Schwartz, and Davidson. You give people two questionnaires. One is a trait anxiety questionnaire. And I don't know if you know the Marlowe-Crown scale of social desirability. It has questions on like, I never lie, yes or no. And it's sometimes taken as a measure of self-presentation or social desirability, as it's called, in that clearly everybody has lied at some point. So if you say, I never lie, yes, that's true, well, then you're the sort of person who likes to present yourself in a favourable way, even when it's untrue. Well, that's one reading of it, that it's a matter of social desirability and self-presentation. But the other reading is, and surely that's part of it, but maybe also part of it is self-deception. Are you the sort of person who deceives yourself about your true nature? It's a protection of self-esteem. So you could call that defensiveness. So to the extent that it measures that, these authors divide people on low and high on this questionnaire. So now, if you have low trait anxiety, you say, in general, trait means your dispositions in general over an extended period of time. Not necessarily right now, but in any situation. If you have low trait anxiety, but high on Marlowe-Crown, then there could be a group of people here who are just presenting themselves to themselves as low anxiety. They're deceiving themselves they have low anxiety, but actually they have high anxiety, and these are the repressors. And then we can classify all these. This is the terminology Weinberger et al. Used. If you're low on Marlowe-Crown and low trait anxiety, you're low anxious. High trait anxiety, low Marlowe-Crown, high anxious, and then this final cell here, defensive, high anxious. So is there any evidence that repressors, so measured, can be demonstrably highly anxious, even though they say of themselves they're low anxious? So Naz Derrickson and Michael Eysenck had this interesting study. Derrickson was at Sussex for a little while, about 10 years ago. So they gave subjects a task which pretty reliably elicits anxiety, namely to give a 4-minute public talk to other students. While they're given the talk, they were videoed, so they could be assessed for behavioural manifestations of anxiety, and heart rate was monitored. And halfway through the talk, they rated themselves how anxious it seemed to them they were. So now, well, over here on this side, we've got heart rate, beats per minute. We see the low anxious people, compared to, say, the high anxious people, they do indeed have a lower heart rate. But now if you take the repressors, who rate themselves just as low in anxiety as the low anxious people, their heart rate is non-significantly different from the others here. They have the same heart rate as the high anxious people. So the heart's pounding away. And when we get other people, the judges, these are these dark blocks here, to rate the repressors' behavioural signs of anxiety, you know, twitching, shaking, facial expression, and so on, they rate the repressors as more anxious than the low anxious subjects, even though they score the same on the anxiety questionnaire. But meanwhile, the repressors rate themselves as less anxious than the low anxious people rate themselves. So we have here this double dissociation between what people are saying about themselves and the behavioural and physiological manifestations. So repressors say they're not anxious, but they say they're significantly less anxious than another group, even though they have significantly more physiological signs of anxiety and, what's more convincing, specific behavioural signs of anxiety. Everyone with me on the experiment? Yes?
But if they felt like they weren't nervous, then whatever their like physical and behavioral signs were, their speech and what they conveyed should have been like calm and straightforward.
Well, that's what this is saying. The speech and behaviour necessarily wasn't calm, straightforward and smooth.
Were the participants told that they were repressors? Like afterwards, did they say, "Oh, it looks like you do have anxiety," because that might trigger anxiety in people who
are desperately repressing it. Yes, I don't know about the debriefing. I don't think the paper talked about that. But that's an interesting point. Actually, I'll come to something in the next slide that bears on that. Just say to the person next to you, do you think this is evidence for unconscious anxiety? All right, any reactions? Skeptics?
I don't think it shows unconscious anxiety. I think often people who are highly anxious and who aren't very confident are told to fake it till they make it. So they're told to pretend to be more confident than they are, or to be less anxious than they are, in order to eventually become less anxious than they are. And I think this is just evidence that perhaps that doesn't work or isn't working for people in this situation. So there are people who are highly anxious and they're conscious that they're highly anxious, but they're trying to fake being less anxious in order to kind of bring down their anxiety levels, and I think this is just evidence for that not working.
Okay. So it's not necessarily just a matter of your presentation to other people, it's trying to change yourself by saying to yourself, I'm not anxious, I'm not anxious. Yes, good point.
But in either case, whether it's that or if it's unconscious anxiety, surely this doesn't, you can't tell from this data anyway, because you don't know what if they are trying to deceive themselves or if they do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So
We don't know if they're deceiving themselves or deceiving others.
exactly.
Yes.
So you couldn't really say.
Okay, yes. Any other thoughts? Yes.
And this kind of responses could be still culture specific, compared with most of the Western students. I like to say students in the Oriental culture tend to have more unconscious anxiety.
Okay.
Yeah, so even in the case of me, when I started to talk about something, I did not notice nervous or something, and on many occasions, suddenly I found that I could not do as well as I have expected, possibly because of the influence of the unconscious anxiety.
So you didn't do as well as you expected. That could be
Yeah.
put down to nerves, even though you didn't think that you were anxious.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, but sometimes the interesting phenomenon is that, though I was afraid that I could be very nervous, but I could do quite significantly better than I have expected, especially when I was interested in what I was talking about.
So sometimes you think you're anxious when you're
Yeah,
not.
but-
So the converse problem.
Yeah, that's something
Yes.
interesting.
Yes. A sort of your conscious experiences of anxiety, but you're not actually anxious. Yeah, that's the opposite of unconscious anxiety. That's
Yeah.
also an interesting issue.
So it could be attributed to our past experience of being praised or being criticized. We talk about something wrong, something correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, so some questions to raise about this specific study is self-deception or other deception, which we're talking about here. Derrickson and Ising had an experiment where they rigged the subjects up to a lie detector. It's called the bogus pipeline. You tell them it's a lie detector, and a lot of people break down under these circumstances and start saying, no, it was really like this. And they change the opinion of things they were talking about. However, repressors maintain the low anxiety ratings under these conditions, suggesting that maybe it's self-deception, not other deception. Not all studies replicate the heightened physiological measures of arousal in repressors. So here's a recent paper that doesn't. But when I looked at the papers referred in there, 50% of them do show the effect, and 50% is about what you expect for psychology studies. You get 50% of papers showing an effect one way, 50% non-significant, and there's a dozen papers or so. That's pretty convincing evidence. Now, but here's another question. We don't know if rated anxiety increased for repressors, because we only got the anxiety halfway through the talk. Maybe it did increase, but just not as much as for high anxious people. Or maybe increased just as much, but from a lower baseline. But let's say the rated anxiety did increase a bit. Can we really say it's unconscious anxiety? Even if it didn't increase by a lot, but it increased by a bit. So what would be nice to find is a study where the emotion doesn't change at all due to our manipulation, but we have evidence of the emotion. So finally, this is pretty much the last experiment. Winkleman has been looking at unconscious emotion for a while. I guess this is his classic and best experiment. He suggests that when people are in positive and a negative mood, you'll consume more. When you're happy, you want to drink more, eat more, and so on. So, if that's right, consumption can be used as an index of mood, even if the mood is unconscious. So this is what he did. Subjects were primed with happy or angry or neutral faces, depending on their condition. Then, after that subliminal priming, they pour an amount of drink. They said, are you thirsty? They rate their thirst. They can pour however much of a drink they want, and then they can drink it. This is what they found. First of all, as we had to do for a previous study we looked at with thirst and subliminal perception, you break up subjects into low, medium, and high thirst, and we're looking at the thirsty subjects. This one is the amount poured compared to angry and happy people. The happy people pour more of the drink than angry people, and they drink more of the drink. But if you look at the rated emotion, it's non-significant. So you have no change in emotion from baseline to after priming. No significant change, but a change in some behaviour that maybe tenuously, but nonetheless has been related to emotion. Namely, your ability to go out and enjoy the world, as it were. Eat, drink, and be merry. Similar study primed, but this time with words, unfair or fair. And then people rated the facial expression, and the claim in this study is there's no significant change in rated emotion, but you had a more angry facial expression after unfair had been subliminally showed rather than fair. Now these studies are probably the best studies we have for unconscious emotion, but I just want to raise a criticism which might be a little bit unfair, but nonetheless is valid. I say unfair because they can be applied to almost every study in psychology, but certainly applies in this case. These are the rules by which the unconscious has been demonstrated up to now in many cases. For unconscious emotion, the logic is there was a significant change in behavioural or physiological measures of emotion, but no significant change in rated emotion. The conclusion is there's no change in conscious emotion, so emotion was unconscious. Similar logic is applied subliminal perception, implicit learning. For the objective threshold, a significant change in priming, but non-significantly above chance in an objective measure. So objective performance was a chance, perception was unconscious. Zero correlation criteria, no significant relationship between confidence and accuracy. So therefore there's no relationship between confidence and accuracy. The crucial thing here is going from non-significance to the claiming, the assertion of no difference. And that inferential step is completely invalid, but nonetheless taken by almost everybody in almost every paper you read. But now, as some of you will know, there's been a huge shake-up. That's all changing, and the rules are being rewritten. And in a few years, things will be very different. The problem is, people have been using significance testing as the means of inferential testing, and significance testing doesn't distinguish between evidence for the null hypothesis of no difference, no change in emotion, non-significantly different from baseline, from not having good evidence. It only distinguishes these two against having evidence for the alternative hypothesis, for there being a difference. It makes, no matter what the p-value, no distinction is made between having no evidence, worth its salt, and having evidence for no difference. Those are lumped together as if they're one thing. Well, as some of you know, Bayes solves that problem because it makes the three-way distinction that you need between evidence for no difference and no evidence. So I hope in the field, unconscious emotion, as well as subliminal perception, as well as all of psychology, we can rewrite the rules and we can have the following improvements. for unconscious emotion, change in behavioural physiological measure of emotion, and no change in rated emotion, as shown by Bayes, indicating you actually have positive evidence for no effect. And so on for the other cases where the unconscious is inferred from a non-significant result. We should stop doing that, and it has to be done by Bayes. So the upshot is that there really isn't a lot of work on unconscious emotion, although it's, I think, a fascinating concept and field. We do have some studies, the Winkleman and Thong Tan and Tan from Singapore, which would be really good if the Bayesian analyses had borne them out. But they're sort of a beginning, because you could argue, well, drinking more, is that really a measure of happiness? Well, a little bit, tenuously. It's getting there. But what would be good is we want lots of different measures of happiness and show that behaviourally, physiologically, in all sorts of ways, the person is shown to be happy, but they don't know it. So we're making a start, and just not quite there yet.